My former boss, Arthur Vance, believes that framing me for his misdeeds would rescue his career. He did not realize that was the final mistake he would ever make. He believed that money was his greatest weapon. He was wrong. His main weakness was something he genuinely enjoyed. I look out the window of my tight Queens flat, the cool glass against my forehead. The faint, constant wail of a distant siren serves as the city's lullaby, and I've come to equate it with a peculiar kind of freedom. The scars on my knuckles have faded to pale, silvery lines that are nearly undetectable until the light strikes them just right. They're a memento from a life I barely remember, a reminder that surviving sometimes entails becoming someone else. 5 years. It feels like a lifetime. Long enough for a bright-eyed kid to die and be replaced by something harsher, colder. Long enough to plan. 5 years ago, I wasn't glancing at the building across the alley with its graffiti-covered brick wall. I was on the 34th level of the Vance Capitol building, looking out over Midtown Manhattan's huge steel and glass canyon. The sun would shine into my office, glistening off the polished mahogany of my desk and the silver frame of the photograph I kept there. It was a photo of my parents taken during my college graduation. Their smiles were broad, brimming with pride that felt like the entire point of my life. I was Leo Thompson, a 24-year-old rising star and the golden boy of a boutique investment business that was making headlines. And I owed everything to one man, Arthur Vance. Even now, it's difficult to reconcile the two sides of him in my mind. The Arthur I knew back then was in his late 50s, with a mane of distinguished silver hair, a grin that could disarm regulators and charm widows out of their inheritances, and a pure, southing baritone voice. He strode around the world with the unwavering assurance of a guy who believed the cosmos was working in his favor. For me, he was more than simply a boss. He was a mentor and father figure. He recognized something in me, a natural ability for recognizing the story woven into the numbers, and he cultivated it. I remember one afternoon when I was introducing a new algorithm for developing market investments. The meeting room looked frightening, all dark wood and black leather, with a vista that would make even a king feel small. I was apprehensive, but the data was accurate. I clicked through the final slide, my heart beating steadily against my ribs. The room fell silent for a beat before Arthur began clapping slowly and deliberately. "Brilliant, Leo," he said, his voice filling the room. "Absolutely brilliant." He approached and rested a hefty, paternal hand on my shoulder. "You don't just see the numbers, you see the story behind them. You remind me of myself when I was your age." The praise felt like a palpable warmth spread across my chest. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice somewhat shaky. "I learned from the best." He chuckled in a deep, genuine tone. His gaze shifted to my desk, which was visible through the conference room's glass wall, and settled on a photograph of my parents. "They must be very proud," he replied with a warm smile. He squeezed my shoulder. "Stick with me, kid. In 5 years, you won't just be a partner. You'll be sitting in my chair." I believed him. I believed every word. That was my error. I saw him as a goal, the man I wished to become. I didn't realize I was only a vehicle, a throwaway component of his engine, and that he had already planned my demise. I trusted him with my job and the future I planned my family. My trust was the tool he would eventually use to sever my throat. The day it all ended began as any other Tuesday. The coffee was nasty, the market was turbulent, and I was swamped with quarterly reports. A peculiar tension pulsed around the office, but I dismissed it as pre-earnings anxiety. Then, at precisely 10:17 a.m., the glass doors to our floor broke open with a thunderclap. "FBI, nobody movie! Hands wiry, I can't see Tim!" The world descended into pandemonium. Men and women wearing dark blue vests with prominent yellow letters rushed the floor, their actions swift and precise. Phones clattered on desks. A woman yelled from behind me. My own breath caught in my throat, and my body froze in utter disbelief. My initial instinct, stupidly, was that it was a mistake. They were on the incorrect floor. Then I saw Arthur. While everyone else was scared or confused, he remained calm. He walked forward cautiously, his face a mask of deep sadness. 2 operatives flanked him and listened closely as he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His calm authority cut through the chaos. Then he pointed, directly at me. "He's the one you're looking for," Arthur said, his voice cold and devoid of the avuncular charm I was used to. The voice was that of a stranger, the senior portfolio manager. He had sole access to the segregated accounts. I trusted him. He gave one of the agents a big manila folder. I knew, with a dreadful certainty that surged like vomit in my throat, what was inside. It was a ghost story, a wonderfully crafted fantasy about my own avarice. Fabricated emails, fraudulent were transfer signatures, and backdated documents authorizing deals I never conducted. A breadcrumb trail linking a crime to a scapegoat. Me. My thoughts tried to catch up to reality. Mr. Vance. I began, my voice scarcely audible. What are you talking about? You told me to. I remembered him asking me to consolidate the Retiree Plus assets into a new holding account for a special investment vehicle. It was a chance too excellent to pass up, he'd said. A legacy maker. Arthur interrupted me, his voice filled with hate that seemed like a physical blow. Don't you dare put your failures on me, son. He referred to me as son. The word, which had previously been a term of love, was now a lethal weapon. His eyes met mine for a tiny moment. There was nothing there. There was no regret, no pity. Only the flat, frigid emptiness of a locked door. The man I admired vanished in an instant. In his place stood a monster which I now comprehended. I was not his protege. I was his fall guy. The cold steel handcuffs that closed over my wrists marked the end of my life. As they dragged me away in a swirl of stunned expressions and overturned coffee cups, I looked back over my shoulder. Arthur Vance wasn't even looking. He was gently straightening his silk tie in the mirror of a computer display, as if he were only dusting lint from his suit jacket. The next several weeks were a montage of humiliation, including a slow-motion automobile wreck that I was forced to witness from the driver's seat. The perp's walk out of the building was the worst. A swarm of flashing cameras and shouted inquiries. Leo, did you do it? How could you steal from retirees? My face was plastered across the nightly news, my confident corporate headshot juxtaposed with the sight of me, wary and handcuffed, being forced into the back of an unmarked car. The Wall Street Journal's title read like a personal death sentence. Wall stare at Wui his kids poisi himi kremblis, hundreds of radaries devastan ed. You're one smart child. They made me sound like an animated evil. The interrogation chamber was a bland box meant to strangle optimism. I told them the truth repeatedly, my voice becoming hoarse. I explained Arthur's orders, the account structure, and the trust I had placed in him. The agents simply nodded, their expressions expressionless, periodically sliding a document across the table for me to identify. My signature is expertly forged. An email with cleverly modified headers was received from my account. It was a masterpiece of deception. Arthur had been planning this for months, possibly years. The hardest thing was calling my folks. I can still hear my mother's loud, pained gasp when I told her I had been detained. Then came the frenzied questioning, the incredulity, and a choking sob that shattered my heart into a million pieces. My father answered the phone, his voice filled with a mix of shame and rage that I couldn't endure. They'd made enormous sacrifices for me, working extra shifts and mortgaging their future to provide a better life for their son. And this is how I paid them back. Their pride, which had driven me throughout my life, had turned to ash. I watched them on the news, gathered on their sofa, my mother sobbing into a handkerchief and my father staring at the screen with the blank eyes of someone who has lost faith. My existence was systematically demolished. My apartment was confiscated. My savings were frozen as proceeds of a crime. The career I had poured my heart and soul into was no more. My name was no longer an asset, but rather a disgrace. The trial was a farce. I was a ghost during my own execution. My court-appointed lawyer was well-intentioned but completely outmatched. On the other side of the aisle stood Arthur's legal team, led by a shark named Sarah Chen. She was youthful, bright, and extremely efficient. She presented me as a selfish, ambitious monster who had betrayed his master and preyed on the weak. She cited my own desire, the long hours I worked, and the drive Arthur commended as proof of my ravenous greed. The prosecution called a series of victims to the stand. Elderly men and women, their expressions carved with anxiety and despair. They spoke of their life savings, the money for their grandchildren's schooling, and the nest fund that was meant to see them through their later years, all of which had vanished. And whenever they spoke, they looked at me. Their eyes were filled with hurt, not fury. They saw me as the man who ruined their life. Meanwhile, Arthur portrayed the elder statesman, a grieved victim of a dreadful treachery. He testified reluctantly, blotting his eyes with a handkerchief. He described how he had treated me like a son, giving me every opportunity, only to be stabbed in the back. The jurors ate it up. In a move reminiscent of backroom agreements, the Securities and Exchange Commission slapped him with a paltry fine for inadequate oversight, a speeding penalty for a man who caused a multi-car pileup. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the world appeared to slow down. I could hear the hum of the courtroom lights, the shuffling of papers, and a quiet cop from someone in the gallery. Leo Thompson. The judge's voice echoed, "On the charge of securities fraud, this court finds you guilty. I sentence you to 10 years in federal prison." The gavel came down. A sharp, decisive snap. The sound of a door slamming. The sound of justice failing. I caught eyes with Arthur one more time across the courtroom. He did not even have the decency to look away. He simply nodded at his lawyer, expressing modest satisfaction. For him, I had already left. A difficulty is solved. A bit of lint is brushed away. The first year in prison is about erasure. They take your name and assign you a number. They take your clothes and give you a uniform. They steal your life and make it a habit. The universe is reduced to the size of a concrete box with the scraping of a metal door, the odor of antiseptic, and hopelessness. I spent the first few months in a state of fury and self-pity. I'd relive the betrayal in my head, examining every conversation, smile, and word of encouragement from Arthur, looking for the lie I'd been too blind to notice. The rage was a fire that kept me warm in the chilly emptiness of my cell, but it was also consuming me from within. The turning point did not occur in a flash of lightning or a dramatic revelation. It came in a cardboard box. Before abandoning my doomed case, my lawyer had forwarded me a box of paperwork. There were letters buried behind legal records and motions. There are plenty of them. They were from the victims, addressed to the court, the prosecutor, and anybody who would listen. They were intended to be used against me to demonstrate the human cost of my crime. I had never seen them before. For weeks, I left the box in the corner of my cell, a monument to my demise. One night, unable to sleep and plagued by the same repetitive recollections, I eventually opened it. I chose a letter at random. The penmanship was unsteady, and the blue ink faded on the thin, lined paper. It was from Eleanor Gable. "My husband, Frank, worked at the steel mill for 40 years, she said. He'd come home every night covered in soot, his back aching, but he never complained. He'd just smile and say we were building a future. That money, the money Mr. Thompson took, was supposed to be for our granddaughter's college. She wants to be a doctor. Now, it's all gone. Frank had a heart attack 2 months after we got the news. The doctors said it was his weak heart, but I know the truth. He died of a broken heart. He died because a man I clutched the small paper in my hands, and something inside me broke. The self-pity and wrath simply vanished, leaving only a profound, crushing weight. It wasn't about my failed career anymore. It wasn't about my destroyed reputation or the years taken from me. It was about Frank Gable, a man who had spent his entire life working in a steel mill and whose heart broke when his future was taken away. It was about his granddaughter, who wanted to become a doctor. I read every letter. A retired firefighter who has lost his disability pension. The school teacher had to sell her house. The immigrant couple's American dream had turned into a nightmare. Arthur Vance composed a symphony of sorrow, with each letter serving as a new song. My name appeared on the sheet music, but he wrote the score. Tears ran down my cheeks, not for myself, but for them. In the furnace of secondhand sadness, a new feeling began to emerge. It began as a frigid spark in the pit of my stomach and gradually developed into a frozen resolve. Revenge was not enough. Making Arthur bankrupt would not solve anything. Money was his language, but it was not his most valuable asset. Destroying his company would be an inconvenience rather than a punishment. I did not want to take his money. I wanted to take his soul. I wanted to help him comprehend. I had to make him experience the pain he had inflicted on so many others. He had to bear the burden of a broken heart. The prison library served as both my sanctuary and my training ground. I wasn't like the other inmates, who pumped iron in the yard and turned their bodies into weapons. I was developing my thoughts. I studied books on company law, looking for every loophole and nasty trick Arthur had employed. I studied finance not to generate money, but to learn how to demolish a financial empire from the inside. However, my most essential topic was psychology. behavioral economics, cognitive biases, social engineering, and the study of empathy. I discovered that the human mind is the world's most complex security system, and every system has a vulnerability. I became an observer. I observed the guards, learning about their routines, vanity, and little corruptions. I listened to the other inmates, discovering how they manipulated, lied, and lived. I learned to recognize the tiny cues in a man's posture, the flicker of fear in his eyes, and the tremor of lying in his voice. The innocent, trusting child who walked into prison died in that library. In his place emerged a patient, calculating predator. The Wall Street wolf had been skinned, but another type of predator was developing a new coat. After 3 years, I received parole for good behavior. When I went out of the federal penitentiary, the sunshine felt strange against my skin. The world seemed louder, faster, and more vivid than I remembered. I was a ghost, returning to a life that had carried on without me. My parents had downsized and relocated to a small town in Florida, devastated by the embarrassment. They loved me, but my presence served as a constant, agonizing reminder of what they had lost. I did not want to be that for them. So I rode the bus to New York, leased the cheapest accommodation I could find in Queens, and went to work. My new flat was minimal, with simply a mattress on the floor and a folding table. The highlight of the room was a huge whiteboard that I had purchased with the remainder of my gate money. It quickly became a large, sophisticated web of links, timelines, and images. It was not a financial map for Vance Capital. It was a psychological profile of Arthur Vance. I followed his life in meticulous detail. His commercial activities, social calendar, and political contributions. But I knew his companionship wasn't his main weakness. Arthur was not at the center of my web, holding the key to everything. It was an image of a 17-year-old girl smiling with her father's confident eyes and a bright, intellectual expression. Emily Vance, his only kid, his pride and joy. The one thing in his life he truly, selflessly adored. She was his greatest treasure, and I was about to turn her into his greatest sorrow. My approach did not include a hostile takeover or a market catastrophe. It was significantly more pernicious. I called it the empathy trade. The idea was simply Arthur Vance was a psychopath who couldn't feel empathy for the individuals he'd harmed. So I was going to force the transaction. I planned to make him experience their agony through the one person whose pain he couldn't ignoring his daughter. I developed a new identity. Leo Thompson was dead. I was now Alex Miller, a freelance financial consultant and volunteer for the Second Chance Foundation, a nonprofit that existed solely on a cheap website that I created myself. My objective, I informed them, was to assist victims of financial fraud pro gratis. I started with Mrs. Gable. I discovered her living in a little, run-down apartment on Staten Island. When I knocked on her door, she paused, her eyes filled with the wary distrust of someone who had been injured too many times. I introduced myself as Alex and did not ask for money. I merely requested to hear her story. We sat in her modest, chaotic living room, with a photograph of her late husband, Frank, on the mantelpiece. She talked for hours, and I simply listened. I heard stories about Frank, their goals, and the granddaughter who is now working 2 jobs to pay for community college. I recorded her as she spoke, using a small, high-quality audio recorder in my pocket rather than evident camera. In the end, I didn't give sympathy. I offered practical assistance. I spent the following 2 weeks guiding her through the maze of Social Security benefits, locating a grant that could aid her granddaughter, and consolidating her tiny debts into a reasonable plan. I utilized the talents Arthur had taught me, the skills that had landed me in prison, to repair a small piece of my broken existence. I did it again and again. I found the retired firefighter, the instructor, and the immigrant couple. I became their confident and quiet rescuer. I listened to their experiences, documented their anguish, and then applied my knowledge to help them. I never told them who I was. To them, I was simply Alex, the pleasant young man from the foundation. But with each story I gathered, I was creating a new weapon, an emotional armory aiming right at Arthur's heart. My road eventually brought me to a clean and modest home in Flushing, Queens. The mailbox bore the name, Chin. It belonged to Sarah Chen's elderly mother, the same lawyer who had effectively eviscerated me on the witness stand. Mrs. Chen was also a Vance Capital victim, as I discovered when my research. The irony was nearly poetry. I took the same strategy. I was Alex, the volunteer, Mrs. Chen was a sweet, lovely woman who spoke broken English. She'd lost a sizable chunk of her funds, the money she needed to live out her days without becoming a burden on her high-achieving daughter. I spent a Saturday afternoon at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of complicated financial statements and insurance policies. I assisted her in creating a new budget, deciphering the language, and finding a better, more reasonable healthcare supplement. She was so thankful that she insisted on making me tea and informing me about her daughter, the great lawyer. "She works so hard," Mrs. Chen exclaimed, her eyes full of pride. "Very important firm. Very successful." The front door opened while I was packing my briefcase. "Mom, I'm here," a crisp, familiar voice announced. I brought groceries. Sarah Chen walked into the kitchen and came to a complete halt. Her eyes, as intelligent and penetrating as I remembered, shifted from her mother to me. I felt a jolt, a rush of pure adrenaline, yet my expression remained serene and pleasant. "Oh, Sarah," her mother said, delighted. "This is Alex, the kind young man I told you about. He's helping me for free. Such a good boy." Sarah looked at me, a frown on her brow. Her eyes flickered with recognition, a bewildered trying to place a face expression that made the hairs on my arm stand up. She knew she had seen me before, but the situation was completely wrong. The wary, defeated guy in the orange jumpsuit from the trial contrasted with the polite, helpful Alex, seated at her mother's kitchen table. "Nice to meet you," I said, offering my hand. My voice was even, and my grin was genuine. It needed to be. She shook my hand firmly, her gaze still probing my face. "You too," she added, her tone tinged with mistrust. I politely exited, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was a calculated but necessary risk. Sarah Chen was ambitious, but I could see she wasn't as soulless as Arthur. The fact that her own mother had fallen prey to the scam she'd supported had to be a source of remorse, a fracture in her professional armor. I merely needed to water it. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. I had planned on that. The weird familiarity of my features gnawed at her. She would have returned to her old case files, pulled up a photo of Leo Thompson, and the reality would have struck her like a physical blow. The good boy. Assisting her mother was the same man she had helped put to prison. The guy whose life she had helped wreck in order to further her career, all for the sake of a client who had, in turn, caused her own mother to be duped. The guilt must have been unbearable. 2 days later, an anonymous email arrived in my mailbox. "I know who you are," it said. "Meet me. Pier 17, tomorrow, 8 p.m. The air along the East River was cold and biting. Sarah waited for me in the shadows, her collar drawn up against the breeze. She didn't appear like the confident warrior I recalled in the courtroom. She appeared haunted. "Why?" she inquired, her tone low. "Why are you helping my mother?" "Because she needed help," I explained simply. "Like dozens of other people your client ruined. Are you planning on suing him?" "Trying to get the case reopened." I shake my head. The legal system already had its chance. It failed. This isn't about courts or money. She gazed at me, her eyes adjusting to the darkness and attempting to understand. "Then what is it about?" I decided to trust my instincts. I told her everything. The empathy trade. "The plan is to use Emily." I spelled it all out, my voice as icy and steady as the river next to us. I anticipated her to be shocked and threaten to call the cops. Instead, she remained silent for a long time, staring at the distant lights of Brooklyn. "He lied to me," she eventually said, more to herself than to me. "He looked me in the eye and swore he was just as blindsided as everyone else. I built my career on that lie." She turned back to me, her face hardened with purpose. "His 60th birthday party is in 3 weeks. At his estate in Greenwich. Everyone will be there. The most powerful people in New York." She took out her phone and forwarded me a file. It was a comprehensive report on the Vance family. The estate's security standards, the food company's timetable, the guest list, and, most significantly, a complete profile of Emily, including her friends, habits, social media presence, and deeply idealistic worldview. "I can get you an invitation," she explained. "As my guest?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's better if I'm not there. I need to be a ghost." She nodded, indicating comprehension. "Then what do you need?" "I need a gift delivered," I explained. "And I need you to make sure his daughter is the one who finds it." The night of Arthur Vance's 60th birthday party was a show of extravagant luxury. The Vance home in Greenwich, Connecticut, was more of a private resort than a house, a huge tribute to a life built on the misfortunes of others. Hundreds of fancy vehicles lined the long, twisting driveway. Music and laughing erupted from the beautifully illuminated home, booming across manicured lawns that lead down to the dark, peaceful waters of the Long Island Sound. From my vantage point in a rented car stopped on a service road half a mile distant, it appeared like a star had fallen to earth. Arthur was at the pinnacle of his cosmos. Inside the glittering mansion, he was surrounded by friends, politicians, and business titans, all of whom had come to honor him. He was untouchable, a king in his own castle. But I knew something that he didn't. A Trojan horse had already entered the gates. An hour ago, a delivery van from a high-end electronics store in Manhattan arrived at the service gate. A young man in a clean uniform handed up a single, elegantly wrapped box to the gift table supervisor. It was a new iPad Pro, the largest model. The attached card was straightforward, printed in a beautiful style on heavy cardstock. The message read, "From a forgotten friend." My role was finished. Now it was entirely up to Sarah and Emily. I had a single earpiece attached to a burner phone. The line was open. Sarah was on the other end, holding her phone in her clutch purse and giving me a subtle play-by-play. "He's making the rounds," she mumbled, her voice barely audible above the noise of the celebration. "Emily looks beautiful. He's doting on her, introducing her to a senator. He's so proud, Leo. It's sickening. Is the gift in place?" I inquired, my voice tense. "In his private study on the corner of his desk, just as we planned." "Good. Now we wait." The waiting was the most difficult part. Every minute seemed like an hour. I observed the mansion's lights, envisioning the scenario within. The clinking of champagne glasses, the fake laughing, the web of power and influence being weaved around every corner. And in the midst of it all, Arthur Vance basked in the glory of his triumph, fully unaware of the reckoning that was looming over him. Finally, Sarah's voice returned to the line. "He's about to make his speech. It's time." I heard a spoon tap against a glass, and the festive hubbub subsided. Arthur's voice, boosted by a microphone, was full of warmth and confidence. "My friends, my family," he said, "thank you all for being here tonight. As I look around this room, I see the faces of people who with me on an incredible journey." Sarah made her move while Arthur was enjoying his guests' admiration. She discovered Emily by the French doors that led to the terrace. "Emmeline, you look stunning," Sarah replied, her tone a wonderful mix of appreciation and casualness. I could hear everything via the phone. "Thanks, Sarah. It's a bit overwhelming." "I know. Listen, I think someone left a really special gift for your father in his study. It looked quite personal. Maybe you should bring it out to him before he cuts the cake. I think he'd love that." The bait was laid. Emily, the dutiful daughter, eager to please her father on his special night, accepted it without hesitation. "Oh, that's a great idea. I'll go get it." My heart began to beat in a frenzied, heavy rhythm against the sternum. This was it. The result of years of agony, scheming, and patient, frigid rage. Emily's heels clicked softly on the hardwood floor as she moved away from the party and into the peace and quiet of her home. I heard the door to the study creak open. A minute of stillness. "She's in," Sarah murmured. "She's found the box." Emily noticed the nicely wrapped gift on her father's desk inside the oak-paneled study, which was a sanctuary of leather-bound books and costly cigars. She smiled, assuming it was a nice surprise from a close friend. She carefully undid the ribbon before lifting the lid. The iPad sprang to life in her hands. The screen was stark and empty, except for a solitary video file icon in the center. The title was simple, Their Stories. Curious, she tapped it. Outside, on the large terrace, Arthur was reaching the peak of his speech, his voice full with emotion. "I've been blessed with success, with friendship. But my greatest blessing, the achievement I am most proud of, is my daughter, Emily." A surge of applause raced through the audience. The video started playing in the study room. Mrs. Gable's face appeared first. Her image was absolutely clear, her voice faltering yet unwavering. "My husband, Frank, he worked at the steel mill for 40 years. Intercut. On the deck, Arthur raises his drink. To my daughter, who I've always taught the value of honesty and integrity, a quality I hold above all else." Emily's smile falters when she is studying. Her forehead furrows with perplexity. "Who is the old woman who is crying?" The iPad, Mrs. Gable's voice crackles.
Hurrah.
"He said our money was safe. He said Arthur Vance was a good man." My husband died because he believed that lie. Emily's face is drained of color. Her hand flies towards her mouth. This is not a birthday greeting. The terrace, the audience whispers in delight. Arthur grins, the epitome of a pleased father. The studio fresh face comes on the screen. A man in his 60s with the tired look of public servant. I was a firefighter, he explains. I lost both my legs on 9/11. That settlement was all I had. Vance Capital said they'd make it grow. Now I don't know how I'm going to live. Emily stumbles back and bumps into the desk. A terrified gasp escapes from her lips. Tears start to well in her eyes. The video continues, a never-ending cascade of human agony. A teacher has lost her home. A young couple has lost their down payment. Dozens of faces, dozens of stories, each one a reminder of her father's violence. The video incorporates press clippings, headlines with her father's image, and a devastating headline about the Wall Street whiz kid, Mech taking the blame. The pieces fall into place in her mind, making an image of her father she had never imagined, a monster hidden behind a lovely smile. On the terrace, Arthur's speech is met with tremendous applause. And now, he says cheerfully, I believe it's time for cake. Right then, the French doors to the study flung open. The crowd became silent when Emily emerged. She moved with an unusual, rigid pace, her face palled and smeared with tears. She cradled the lit iPad like a funeral tablet. The music stuttered and stopped. She was the center of attention in the room. She didn't stop until she was standing squarely in front of her father on the improvised stage, the spotlights reflecting the grief on her face. Arthur's smile froze, revealing a look of uncertainty and fear. Emily. Humley. What is it? What's wrong? Her voice was a strained whisper that traveled across the motionless terrace. Dad. Who are these people? She held up the iPad. Mrs. Gable sobbed on screen while clutching a photograph of her late husband. Arthur Vance's gaze shifted from his daughter's damaged face to the TV, and in that moment, his entire universe crumbled. The self-assured smile, the confident posture, the appearance of regal command. It all vanished. It was like watching a marble statue shatter and collapse to dust. For the first time in his life, he appeared tiny. He appeared terrified. He was not terrified of the SEC. He was not afraid about litigation or negative publicity. He has legions of attorneys to handle that. He was horrified by the look in his daughter's eyes. The adoration he had always taken for granted had been replaced by a horrible loathing. That was a wound that no amount of money could ever fix. Emily. I can explain. He began, his voice thin and pitiful. She took a step back, as if his contact would taint her. She shook her head slowly, letting a new wave of tears fall down her face. You're a monster, she cried out. Then she simply dropped the iPad. It crashed into the stone terrace with a horrible crack of broken glass and plastic. She turned and ran into the darkness, her sobbing echoing in the astonished hush. Arthur Vance was left alone on stage, exposed beneath the harsh lights and surrounded by the whispers of hundreds of his friends. He had not lost a single dollar. He'd lost everything. It wasn't a financial failure. It was a moral issue. The empathy trade was completed. The debt was paid in full. 6 months later, the Vance estate in Greenwich on the market. The vast estate, once a symbol of power and accomplishment, has turned into a cold, empty mausoleum. I read in the gossip sections that Arthur had become a recluse. He still had his riches, of course, but it was all paper. Emily had moved to the West Coast, enrolled in a university under her mother's maiden name, and cut off all communication with him. He tried calling, emailing, and sending presents, but they all went unanswered. The only person whose opinion mattered to him suddenly recognized him for who he was. He was left alone with his money and the spirits. He was a wealthy man living in the lowest form of hell. I did not pay close attention to the aftermath. My work was finished. My new life followed its own calm pace. I was seated in a small, sunlit coffee shop in Brooklyn, with aged wooden floors and the strong aroma of roasted coffee beans. Across the table from me, the Garcias, an elderly couple, were reviewing a spreadsheet I'd created for them. They were victims of a different fraud and predator, but their tale was the same: dread, bewilderment, and loss. I was guiding them through a retirement plan, explaining the distinction between an IRA and a 41-month in simple words. I wasn't earning millions anymore. In reality, I was barely getting by. But when I saw Mrs. Garcia's face light up with understanding and the tight knot of concern in her brow loosen, I felt a sensation of richness that my corner office on the 34th floor had never offered. The wrath that had consumed me for years had subsided, leaving behind a peculiar, serene tranquility rather than emptiness. I gazed out the window at the people strolling down the sidewalk, a woman wheeling a stroller, two students laughing, and a man walking his dog. A world filled with stories, hardships, and tiny wins. I was no longer above everything, but rather a part of it. They say that revenge is best served cold, but it wasn't truly about revenge. It was about a debt. It is a debt of anguish rather than money, a loan that was ultimately paid. In the end, I did not ruin Arthur Vance by stealing his money or his freedom. I just put up a mirror and forced him to see his own reflection in his beloved daughter's filled eyes. And some reflections, once seen, cannot be forgotten. I felt a genuine smile on my lips for the first time in a long time. I had not merely restored my life. By assisting others in balancing the balances in my own modest manner, I felt as if I had returned my soul. And that was more valuable than all the money on Wall Street.